If you lose your green card and a year goes by, are you still a resident? If you're outside of the US with your green card and you lose it, how do you get back into the United States? This video is going to be all about maintaining your residency, and these are some of the questions we're going to answer today. Let's start with the general premise that there are only two ways that you can lose your residency once you become a permanent resident. And by the way, none of these ways include losing the card. Losing the card does not affect your immigration status. You will continue to be a permanent resident. It's just more difficult to prove without your permanent resident card. The first way to lose your residency is through abandonment, and we're going to talk about that in more detail. The second way is if an immigration judge orders you removed. You end up in deportation proceedings for some reason, maybe a criminal conviction leads you there, and you don't qualify for a defense from deportation. That's how the second way could play out. Now, abandonment, generally speaking, there are two ways you can abandon your residency. The first way is by spending too long outside of the United States. I'm not going to go into all of the details on that. I have several videos that discuss abandoning your residency and what not to do after you become a permanent resident. The other way is oftentimes when you come back to the United States and you're dealing with Customs and Border Protection, the officer will sometimes ask you to sign a voluntary abandonment form. That's one context in which it could happen. Another context could be if you just don't want to live in the United States anymore, you don't want to pay taxes in the United States anymore, and so you voluntarily abandon your residency, you fill out this form, I-407, and you leave the United States. Generally speaking, any departure outside of the United States which exceeds 1 year presumes that you intended to abandon your residency. It's not always the case. If it wasn't your fault, for example, you traveled to Iran and you were arrested by the government and detained for years, when you try coming back with your residency card, if your intent was to come back within 6 months and through no fault of your own, you had to stay outside of the US for longer than 6 months, there's actually case law on this exact hypothetical that I'm providing where the judge ultimately ruled that that was not abandonment. But when that Iranian came back to the United States, the officer looked at their departure. You've been outside the US for years, brought them to a back room. It's called secondary inspection, interviewed them, and likely tried to get them to sign the I-407 form, voluntary abandonment. In this hypo, the Iranian woman did not sign it. She lawyered up, and in court, an immigration judge ultimately determined that this was not abandonment. But the point remains, any departure of longer than 1 year, presumption of abandonment. Now, if your departure is longer than 6 months, but under 1 year, you should have a good reason for that. This is going to affect other things like your timeline for naturalization. You will no longer be able to naturalize in the fastest possible timeline if you interrupt your continuous presence with a departure. See my video on naturalization for more info on that. Okay, now back to the questions I asked during the intro of this video. If you're outside of the United States and you lose your green card, can you come back? Are you still a permanent resident? The answer to both questions is yes. You would just go to the nearest US embassy or consulate, identify yourself. They can take your fingerprints and identify you, and you would apply for a travel document. You would eventually get one after you're identified and be able to board a plane to come back to the United States. If you're at a land border, you're in Canada or Mexico, along the US border, you can usually just present yourself to Customs and Border Protection. They'll identify you eventually. It'll be a pain, but you'll eventually be identified and readmitted as a permanent resident. The card is not your status. I've had people who lost their card years ago and they've just been living in fear because they thought they're here illegally. Not really true. They're here legally. They just can't prove that they're a resident, and they're probably taking a lot of precautions in the way they live their life that were completely unnecessary. It's as simple as just refiling Form I-90 and getting a new green card. It'll take time and it's a somewhat expensive form, but it's totally doable. It might be easier to conceptualize the green card as a form. The green card is referred to as Form I-551. If you actually look on the back of your green card, it'll say I-551 in the corner. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because there are multiple ways, aside from the green card, where you can prove that you are a permanent resident. Let's say, for example, that you applied to remove the conditions on your green card, and then the green card expired before they fully removed the conditions. Now, your green card's expired and you need to travel for an emergency to visit your dying relative or some emergency. There is actually a way for you to schedule an appointment to get an I-551 stamp, a 1-year temporary stamp in your passport. And when you want to travel back to the United States, instead of showing your unexpired green card, because you don't have one, it's now expired, you would show your expired green card and this I-551 stamp, which is your functional green card until the new card arrives in the mail. If you need guidance on how to get an I-551 stamp in your passport for temporary travel, or your green card has been stolen, it's expired, or it's lost, be sure to contact me. I can always reapply for it. I can give you guidance on how to get the stamp in your passport. And as always, guys, be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the next video.